In our everyday lives, we're surrounded by tons of different sensory experiences, which our brain has to parse through in order to help us make decisions. So let's say, for example, you're at a festival and you're feeling kind of hungry and you're hearing people talk about the different foods that are available, you're seeing the different ones that are available, you start to smell maybe a delicious turkey leg, and you go and you order one, you're holding it in your hand, and you take that first bite, and it's delicious. So what our lab is really focused on is this taste and brain sort of pathway and understanding how the brain processes taste information. If we can understand what the brain is doing with taste information, this could help us better understand the underlying mechanisms behind eating disorders or other issues that may affect the taste system. Our lab uses a mouse model to do this. So with a mouse in mind, let's see how taste information makes its way from the tongue to the brain. So here we have a little mouse that's drinking from a spout. Information about this droplet has to make its way to the brain somehow, and the way that it does this is through specialized cells called neurons, which talk to each other through either electrical or chemical signals. So let's pretend that this little bus represents the taste information from this droplet, and it's going to make its way from these neurons talking to each other to the brain. But what actually happens once it reaches the brain? Well, there are specific regions in the brain along what we call the taste pathway, which you can see the titles and names of above, until ultimately this information passed along through these neurons reaches the gustatory cortex, which is in charge of processing any sort of taste-related information and distinguishing between different types of taste. What's typically not considered part of the taste pathway is a region called the mediodorsal thalamus, which is my region of interest. The mediodorsal thalamus has different roles, but one of the things that's interesting about the mediodorsal thalamus in relation to taste is that it communicates and talks back and forth with the gustatory cortex. Since the gustatory cortex is really responsible for taste processing, could it be that the mediodorsal thalamus plays a larger role in taste processing information on the whole? So to investigate this question, we use an experimental approach in which we implant recording devices into the mediodorsal thalamus of mice to see what these neurons are talking about when the mice experience different tastes. This ends up looking something like this, where each of these red lines represents one of our recording devices located in the kind of spherical region that is the mediodorsal thalamus. Once mice are implanted, and recover from surgery, they undergo training in which they learn to lick to a spout to receive either different taste qualities, such as salty, sweet, sour, bitter, or different taste intensities, so different concentrations of sweet taste or salty taste. So what kind of information do we actually get from these recordings? Well, our recording devices act as little microphones that allow us to listen in on the conversations that these neurons might be having. So we end up with something like this, where each of these little divots is a spike or an action potential, which are those electrical signals that the neurons use to communicate with each other. And that sounds something like this, which would be snaps and cracks to represent each of the different spikes. But since we don't speak the same language as the neurons, we have to visualize the data in a different way. So let's take a look at what we actually find. When we expose our mice to taste qualities, this is an example of one neuron and how it responds to the different tastings. So we have sour, bitter, salty, sweet, and then water as our different tastes. Each of these dots at the top represent the spikes or the action potentials through which the neurons are communicating. And as we can see, there are several green dots here and purple. So lots of spiking activity for sour and bitter from this particular neuron. So it seems that the MD is responding to taste. And we see something similar when we look at taste intensity and the different concentrations. We see those differences in firing potential. So if the overall question is, does the mediodorsal thalamus play a role in processing taste-related information? The answer is yes, because we did see those different responses to the different tastings as well as to sweetness and saltiness. We can say that the MD may actually play a role in taste-related processing of information, which could be important in further findings in the future. Thank you.